Hi, welcome back to our AP Environmental Science virtual classroom. I'm really glad you guys could join us again today. I'm Ms. Fassler. I teach APES at Marshfield High School in Marshfield, Wisconsin. If you want to get the homework that you did with Dr. Sowell yesterday, we're going to start by taking a look at that. What an exciting lecture you had. We actually finished up Unit 2 for review yesterday by looking at more in detail about biodiversity and how disruptions, both natural and anthropogenic, can lead to changes in ecosystem, changes in biodiversity. And you left off with ecological succession and did some work with keystone species. So as Dr. Sowell mentioned yesterday, the question that you looked at draws in from some other topics that we've looked at throughout the year, and we'll eventually get down to that keystone species. But super good practice in letter A here for explaining how electricity is generated by a hydroelectric dam. So remember, when I explain how something happens, I'm describing a process. This was a three-pointed response for letter A, and they wanted to see, although the verbiage or way that I said it could vary a little bit, I had to have three steps that basically converted potential to kinetic energy. I had to have moving water coming into my dam system. I had to have one step that explained or described the conversion of kinetic to mechanical energy, turning the turbine. And I had to have one step that explained the conversion of mechanical energy to electrical energy. Those turbines converted, that rotation of that turbine actually converted that mechanical energy into the production of electricity. In the next step, part B, boy, is this ever a really good example of why you have to take your time, step back, and really read that question carefully. There's a couple things I want you to focus on in the reading of this prompt. First of all, my task verb is identify. I don't need any elaboration or explanation. You're wasting your time. You're not going to get any point for it. All you need to do is simply state, here are two. Notice that that's even in capital letters to prompt you that the reader can only score the first two responses that you identify. And the logic behind that is that we don't want students just throwing out all kinds of answers in the hope that eventually they get one that is correct. And that really doesn't demonstrate a high enough level of knowledge. So identify two. And the other big thing I want you to focus on is the economic benefit. When I'm reading this question in a hurry, it's really easy for me to confuse the word economic with ecological. So the next thing is that they've already kind of eliminated the couple of very obvious answers. I can't talk about generating electricity from the hydroelectric dam, and I can't have any economic factor associated with preventing downstream flooding. So when I look at those possible options, a lot of them really focus around the recreation opportunities surrounding the large reservoir that's created when we dam a river ecosystem. Then you can see some of those other options. So let's just take a step back and just quickly review what's going on with the dam so that those next couple of responses we look at will make a little bit more sense to you. So this is a really cool Google Earth image of Hoover Dam. Remember that my dam is taking the Colorado River, in this case, the natural flow of that river, and putting this very large cement structure there that's holding back all the water. This is that potential energy that's going to go through the intakes, all the working part of the dam that's generating the electricity down here. So think that those dams may have been in place there for decades, and obviously we're really changing the natural ecosystem. So that's where we're going next. Describe an ecological benefit of seasonal flooding of the floodplain of a free-flowing river. So this is one of the disadvantages of building a dam, is that I'm altering the natural habitat of that free-flowing river. And the floodplain is all that area that when the snow melts and the heavy rains in the spring, that river will naturally overflow its bank, and there will be deposition of sediment. So an ecological benefit of that seasonal flooding, a lot of that again has to do with that natural process of flooding. And all of this sediment that was on the bottom of that riverbed is mixed in with that churning water when that heavy rain is running off and the level of that river is rising and rising. All of that sediment on the bottom, and remember, anything that died in that river fell to the bottom of the river and decomposed, and its nutrients were biogeochemically cycled, and all of those nutrients are in that sediment. So that churning sediment is deposited when that river overflows its bank. Um, Other things about the sediment can then reestablish any stream banks that have been eroded. And a lot of times this is really important habitat for some of those river species that might go into that shady bank area to hide from predators. And then again, you can kind of see a few other examples there. I think a lot of people kind of went with something about the fertility of the soil when that nutrient-rich sediment was deposited. So then we go into removing dams from river, undamming the river. Some dams have been removed from rivers. Explain how the removal of a dam can benefit a fish population. Oh, that's right. When we put that dam in there, we really alter habitat. So I think a lot of people went with the idea of restoring the habitat. And again, how important your verbs are here. When I remove that dam, I put the habitat back to the way it was. And a good way to say that is simply to repair that. Remember that this riparian habitat, that refers to the areas along the banks of a stream that have vegetation and again, provide shade and shelter for fish populations. Many of you may have talked about fish that migrate or swim upstream for mating, and that the dam presents a barrier that prevents them from doing that. And again, we can change a lot of these abiotic conditions as well during the restoration. I think this next question was one of the most challenging questions in this FRQ, is it was to describe one negative environmental consequence of the removal of a dam. And I just think that's something maybe we don't think about a lot, but realize that if that dam has been there for decades, it's going to, first of all, I have to be careful how I remove it because I have a massive amount of water stored behind that dam that all of a sudden is going to inundate my downstream habitat. All of that sediment, that important nutrient-rich sediment that we've been talking about, has been held behind the dam. Remember, I don't have that natural flooding process. When I store that water in a reservoir, there could be even harmful substances or pollutants that have accumulated in that sediment that now all of a sudden I'm releasing them and increasing that concentration downstream. Maybe invasive species that had been caught behind the dam. So the bottom line is it's going to take a while. Restoring that ecosystem to its natural ecosystem is wonderful, but there are, it's a little bit of a process to get that done, and we have to make sure it's done correctly. And now is where you got into the real strong application to your great lecture from yesterday on how beavers act as keystone species. Remember that keystone species is that one that holds up or supports many other populations within that ecosystem. And beavers can alter habitat by making a dam, just like a natural dam does, but understand on a very small scale. I mean, there's some beavers that build some pretty big dams, but for the most part, they're creating in a small river or stream ecosystem, they're creating little ponds. They're creating habitat for other organisms that might live there. And then again, you could have talked about sediment and stream bank erosion and things like that. So great question from yesterday. Let's take a look at where we're going today. You've seen this slide a number of times and will probably for, I think we have about 10 or 11 lessons left. Just to remind you about your exam date, that we're testing on the first 7 units, and just to be clear, if your teacher maybe did a slightly different order, when we talk about 7 units, Dr. Sowell and I are systematically going through every learning target, units 1 through 7. So you are going to get a review of all of the content that you're going to see on the exam. Today, we're really going to live within this part of the skills or processes that are used on both of our FRQs. We're going to look at a lot of models and representations of quantitative data and analyze those to explain or describe environmental concepts and processes. So the content that we're looking at today, we're starting in on Unit 3 on populations. And remember that populations within ecosystems change over time in response to a variety of factors. So we're still going to kind of live within this big idea that the Earth is one big interconnected system. We have 2 lessons within Unit 3 on population. So today I'm going to cover the first half of it, reviewing the basic population ecology. And tomorrow, Dr. Sowell will finish up with Unit 3 by looking at human population. But again, our overarching theme throughout this unit is to look at data and look for patterns and trends that we can use to understand and explain environmental processes. So we've got 5 pretty straightforward topics here that all really integrate together, looking at what generalists and specialists are, how that relates to them, to their reproductive strategy, and then we'll get into that population curve and look at resource availability and how that influences populations. Just to remember, you do not have to do any mathematical calculations. Although you will look at data represented graphically, there won't be any manipulating of that data with your calculator. It's good news for a lot of people. So let's just jump right in with a quick review of these reproductive strategies, an R-selected species versus a K-selected species. So we're going to go really quick here. You're going to be ready to jump right in with your answer, yell it out. I've got a characteristic here and then each extreme of that. So let's get started. Tend to be small. Would that be an R strategist or R selected species or K selected species? Small tend to be R, large tend to be K. Number of offspring, few versus many, or a large number of offspring. Live in disturbed or stable environments. Disturbed R selected, more stable K selected. The amount of energy they expend per offspring, a significant amount of energy, K selected, little amount of energy, small amount, R selected. Mature early or late in life. A lot of these are kind of tying together with the term we'll look at here in a second. Their life expectancy, R selected have a short life expectancy, K live much longer. Competition for resources in their habitat. High amount of competition, probably those specialists, those K selected, and R a low competition. And finally, how is their population regulated by density dependent or independent factors? And don't worry, we're going to come back and review that if you're not sure what that idea is, what that idea is asking about. K selected, their population is more controlled by density dependent, and R selected independent. So just a term that does appear in our curriculum, who knows if you're going to see it on the exam, but it is a term you could use, the term fecundity. And it in general takes into account all of these things that describe an R or K selected species reproductive potential. Do they produce a large or small amount of offspring? Do they reach reproductive maturity quickly in life? Because then they can reproduce a lot more. Do they have many litters per year? All of those kind of reproductive characteristics in general, that term that describes those is their fecundity. So we got to take a step back for a minute because we made it sound like all of those characteristics we looked at were super black and white, like, oh, this is, if this organism does this, then it's K selected or it's R selected. And it really is more of a continuous spectrum. Most organisms don't fit that neatly into a little box of K or R selected. And a really good example of that is a sea turtle. They're very large animals. They live a long lifespan, but yet they They walk up onto the beach often at night, they lay a bunch of eggs and then go back into the water and hope that some of those eggs aren't eaten by predators, and that those little baby sea turtles survive. So let's take all of that content that we just reviewed about K and R selected reproductive strategies and dig a little deeper by relating that to their survivorship curve. This should look familiar to you, where on this diagram, I am plotting the relationship between the age of the individuals and how many survive. So for example, in a type 1 survivorship, a late loss survivorship curve, I see that most of my organisms look throughout all of their age across, as I go across their age or lifespan from babies to adults, they don't seem to be having a large drop off in their population. They have a high survival rate. In fact, the majority of their population lives till adulthood and gets into old age and drops off. They're probably dying of old age. On the opposite end of the spectrum, we have this type 3 survival, this early loss. In other words, most of these, notice that they start off with a very high population, but really quickly the number of individuals that survives drops off. And that by the time they're halfway through their lifespan, there's very few of them left. Very few of them live to old age. So let's see if we can relate that to our R and K selected reproductive strategies. Identify the survivorship curve that is characteristic of an R selected species. And now the trickier part, make sure you can explain why. This is where you're going to use your knowledge to not just say, well, it's type 1, 2, or 3. Why is it type 1, 2, or 3? So I'll give you just a second to look at that. And I think that you probably remembered that type 3 survivorship curve would be representative of an R selective because they provide little or no parental care. Therefore, their offspring have a very low chance of survival. On the opposite end of the spectrum, then, we would look at a K selected species, identify the type of survivorship curve that they would display, and explain why. And a K-selected species would exhibit a type 1 survivorship curve. They provide a lot of parental care for their young. Therefore, their young are going to survive later in life, survive to adulthood, and pass on all those traits that make them successful. So the next thing we want to look at is, why are they called R and K selective? And we're going to transition into looking at their growth models. So we know a lot about their fecundity. We know about them being kind of generalist or specialist species. And we can relate that to their survivorship curve. Well, where does the term R and K selected come from? Those terms really describe the population growth method of these two general categories of organisms. So R stands for the high growth rate displayed by R selected species. Notice that I have very generic labels of time and population size with no numbers, so that I can take this basic population growth model and use it to understand both an R selected or a K selected species. So these are selected have a high growth rate. In a very short period of time, their population size has gotten really high. Whereas a K selected species, they start off, their population kind of starts off slow. They don't have a very high rate, growth rate. And then once they reach the carrying capacity, they tend to hover just to go a little bit above, a little bit below. They don't tend to have these wild, really sharp increases and sharp decreases in their population. The carrying capacity is referred to by the letter K, and that's where the K and K strategist comes from. That K comes from a German word meaning, I'm not going to say it, meaning like limit or capacity, but that's K for carrying capacity. So I think we better take a minute and review that idea of carrying capacity so we can make sure and put this all together. There's obviously something that limits the growth, whether I'm an R selected or K selected species. I didn't just keep going and going and going. even though R selected had much wilder swings in their population, there was still something that limited the upper level of that population and made it come back down. That is the carrying capacity. It's the maximum size of a population that the environment can sustain because of resource availability. That's kind of obvious. So what's often confusing to students then is the biotic potential. So let's put these two terms together. This graph, again, very generic axis of time and population size so that I can use it to understand both R and K selected species. My biotic potential is the maximum rate a population could grow under ideal conditions in nirvana. So if I'm an R strategist, I have a high biotic potential. I'm going to reproduce and lay tons of eggs, and I'm going to do that 4 times a year. I basically am born, I reproduce, and that's my mission in life, is to get those traits passed on to the next generation. So if there were nothing limiting me, my population would keep going and going. But we know that eventually my ability to reproduce hits these resistance factors. There's things that are pushing down and preventing that population from keep growing. The intersect of those two things is my carrying capacity. What amount of resources are available in the environment? How many individuals can my environment actually support? I might have the ability to keep reproducing, but the environment can't support that. So you probably remember looking at some of these resistance factors. So we're going to take this idea of things that hold down or prevent populations from keep growing at their biotic potential, and determine if they're density dependent or independent. So by that we mean, does this environmental resistance factor have an influence based on the starting size of the population? Let's go through a couple examples and I think you'll remember. So competition for resources, things like food and space and mates, that is density dependent. If I have 1 individual or 10 individuals in my population, they're not going to be that much competition. 100 individuals in my population, and there's much more competition for those resources. So competition for resources limits the size of my population, and it's dependent on how many individuals are in my population to begin with. The larger my population, the greater the role or impact of competition. What about disease? It's kind of timely because we're doing a lot of social distancing and reducing our population density, because disease is also a density dependent resistance factor. If I have, we talked about white-nosed bat syndrome. So the more bats I have in the population, the more dense my bat population, the more readily a disease, a pathogen can spread from one individual to another. Well, what about a forest fire? Let's talk about some little chipmunks that might be living in my forest. And I have one area that has 10 chipmunks and one area that has 100 chipmunks. It doesn't really matter if what the starting size of my population is. That forest fire is going to limit or hold back the size of my population, independent on how many individuals are there to begin with. And then we have 2 more that I'll let you try on your own. Predation, density dependent or independent. That's obviously dependent as well. And a natural disaster like an earthquake or a flood, independent. Anything that, like this forest fire or this natural disaster, one of those disruptions that is going to kill a lot of individuals in that population, regardless of the starting size. So the bottom line, when resources needed for a population to grow are abundant, the growth rate is going to accelerate. And when those resources are in short supply, that growth rate is going to slow. This is a really interesting idea we're going to dig into in a little bit more detail in just a minute. So let's go through a guided practice together. Oh, little panda bear. I want you to be able to take all of this content that we've learned about R and K selected species and their population growth rates and see if we can explain a broader environmental issue. Why is it, or explain why, an R-selected species tends to be an invasive species, whereas a K-selected species, they tend to be endangered species, or endangered species tend to be K-selected? Well, one of the first things I can talk about is fecundity. So let me kind of model for you how you would say this. I could say that our selected species tend to be an invasive species, or invasive species tend to be our selected species because they have a high reproduction rate. So when they invade or move into an area, they quickly outnumber many of the native species there because of their high reproductive potential. Whereas endangered species tend to be K-selected because they have a low fecundity. If there is a disturbance in their environment, it's going to be very hard for them to rebound or rebuild their population because they reproduce in such low numbers. Our selected species are resource use generalists. They don't really have a very specific type of food that they eat, or maybe they don't have very specific nutrient requirements. They can take advantage of a disturbed area. So here's a picture of kudzu, an invasive plant species that most of us have probably studied, that is very much a generalist. It was initially planted to, I think, to curtail erosion and hold and anchor soil in place because it doesn't have a lot of specific soil requirements and could grow really easily in a new environment that it was introduced in. Endangered species, on the other hand, as a K-selected species, tend to be resource use specialists. Panda bear will eat bamboo, and if they don't have bamboo and there is disturbance to their habitat that alters their food supply, they usually don't have a backup plan to go to. The invasive species take advantage of disturbed areas, whereas endangered species tend to like intact habitat. Kind of got out of whack there. Endangered species like to prefer intact habitat, whereas if I'm an invasive species, it's really easy for me if there's some type of disturbance. I can get in there and get a foothold and take hold before those native species have an opportunity to repopulate. So let's take a look at some population cycles now. And I want to point out to you this essential knowledge statement. This is really what we're digging into here. That the resource base of as a resource base of a population shrinks, the increased potential for unequal distribution of resources will result in increased mortality, decreased fecundity, or both, resulting in population growth declining to or below carrying capacity. So there's just a lot going on here, but I think one good way to illustrate that is to go back to the sort of classic ecological case study of Canada lynx and snowshoe hare and the cyclic nature of their populations of this predator, the lynx, and the prey species, the snowshoe hare. We have really good records because these were both animals that were hunted and sold during fur trading. So we have really good records about how many pelts were being caught and sold so that we could estimate population going back quite a ways. And obviously there's a cyclic nature here. As the predators reach a peak level, the hare tends to react. And initially when we see this, we say, oh, we can explain this because when there's a large population of lynx, then they're going to eat all the snowshoe hare. And so the snowshoe hare population is going to go down. And then when if there's not very many snowshoe hare, the lynx aren't going to have as much to eat, so their population is going to go down. And there's this cyclic nature of it. But it's actually a pretty interesting story. There's a little bit more to it, and it has to do with this decreased fecundity, part of this essential knowledge statement. So these rabbits, the snowshoe hare, have adapted this amazing ability. They're kind of controlling this whole situation. When there's a large lynx population, they kind of say, I'll show you guys, we're just not going to reproduce as much. We're not going to make as much food for you. So instead of 4 litters per year, they might have only 2. Instead of 20 little baby kittens or kits per litter, they're only going to have 7 or 8. So they have this amazing adaptation that they pass on from generation to generation. They maintain their populations just for the long enough for the long-term survival without starving out their predator. And the lynx, as a specialist, has few other dietary options. They're in this Arctic environment where they have really this specialized niche of eating snowshoe hare. And if those snowshoe hare aren't reproducing as much, if they've purposely lowered their fecundity, then the lynx population just isn't going to have as much resource to eat. So it's a very cool story. I'm going to show you just a really cool little clip, about 30 seconds of a nature show on the remarkable rabbit. There's some kind of creepy things about rabbits, but I know some of you have some time on your hand. I'll give you a little sneak preview, and then you might take the opportunity to go and watch the whole show.
These adorable, seemingly passive fur balls are in fact the ultimate survivors. Within their bite-sized frame lies a fighter, able to outwit the many predators that surround them. From frozen forests to concrete jungles, we take you deep into their changing world. We'll reveal just how remarkable rabbits really are.
I mostly just showed you because the baby rabbits were so darn cute. So there's a few other things going on here. So we kind of related that idea of biotic potential and carrying capacity to our selected and K-selected species. We looked at how populations can be cyclic in a predator-prey relationship. The last like essential knowledge part that we want to take a look at here in this section is what happens when a population exceeds its carrying capacity. And there's two big ideas that we want to see here. One is that population can dramatically overshoot. And this happens because there's a little bit of a lag time between that population reproducing and when they actually use up all the resources and their population drops back. So this is another sort of classic ecological data set where we look at the reindeer population on St. Matthew Island. They were introduced into an island ecosystem, so they had a pretty finite area. Isolated area with a finite amount of resources. And you can see that the population took off. They just loved St. Matthew's Island. They eat lichens, and there were a lot of lichens there. And so they skyrocketed in a relatively short period of time to a population of more than 6,000. 2 years later, 99% of that herd had starved to death, and they had a dramatic dieback or crash to their population. And again, because of those density dependent factors that we looked at, disease, competition, and that competition could even be infighting for mates within the species. But they greatly overgrazed and ate all of their food supply. And there was nothing left. They ran up against those density dependent factors. So let's do a quick check for understanding. We've covered quite a bit of information here. 2 days ago, when we talked about island biogeography, I said I'm going to kind of skip over and come back to that idea of generalist specialists. So we can look at this question now and relate island biogeography to what we've just talked about. Highly specialized species tend to evolve on islands because of the environmental conditions and resource availability. Based on the theory of island biogeography, which of the following would most likely experience the greatest decline of specialist species if an invasive species immigrated from the mainland? Take a second to look at that one. Excuse me. You should have said a very small island in close proximity to the mainland, because that would be the easiest one for large numbers of invasive species to immigrate to. Next, we have a survivorship curve. Oh, this is such a fun question. A certain species of dinosaur laid large number of eggs, and the hatchlings had, I gotta move my little thing here. The hatchlings had high mortality early in life. But if they survived, the young dinosaurs were able to grow at a rapid pace, disperse into the environment in order to thrive. Based on this information and the graph above, which of the following best characterizes the species of the dinosaur? Not all dinosaurs were like that. So there's two parts to this question, and you have to get them both right. A, is it an R or a K strategist? And B, is it a type 1 or a type 3 survival? And hopefully you got that dinosaurs were R strategists because of the fact that they laid a lot of young and had a very rapid rate of dispersion. And many of them did not survive into adulthood. They were an early lost species. One more, another great question to interpret which of these models correctly shows or displays the population size over time of an R-selected species that has just colonized a new habitat with abundant resources? And you should see that one that's showing that, pick that letter A, that's showing that exponential growth. There's abundant resources, so they just, I'm guessing this is probably kind of representing the carrying capacity. They just shot right over that carrying capacity because there are selected, they just moved in there, they reproduced very rapidly, and there was no resistance factors early on limiting their population. So let's kind of go through a debrief of how we're going to sort of apply this idea to a larger environmental issue. And that's the idea of ecological management and restoration of wildlife habitat. Dr. Sowell and I, a couple of times, have taken you to the African savanna. And we're going to go there again today for just a couple of minutes, looking at a population of wildebeest. So I'm going to play you just a couple of minutes of the video clip showing us during this restoration process what happens to the wildebeest population, and then we'll take a look at your homework for tonight.
We found in the mid-1970s that the buffalo population was finally stabilizing at around 75,000 animals. Meanwhile, the wildebeest population was continuing to climb and climb at a very fast rate.
Between 1961 and 1973, the wildebeest populations had tripled, reaching 770,000 individuals. Park officials began to worry that they were growing out of control.
Some people thought that we needed to do something about it, and we needed to reduce the population because it may have caused damage to the environment. There was a lot of opinion. We decided that we'd let biology follow its natural course and see what happened.
The population continued to grow until 1977, when it peaked at 1.4 million, the largest herd of large herbivores in the world. The big question was, why had they stopped increasing?
And I'm going to stop it there, and I'm going to let you think about that a little bit. Remember what Dr. Sowell talked about, I think it was yesterday, with trophic cascades and bottom up or top down forces that control a population. So think about that for a little bit. Would that have been a top down forcing that controlled the wildebeest population? So that's pretty crazy growth. Why is it that they all of a sudden leveled out? Did it have something to do with their predators, or was it a bottom up forcing, something to do with their food source? So I'll let you think about that, and you can, we'll come back to that again tomorrow. So let's take a look at the our objectives or goals for today. Describe characteristics of R and K selected species, relate reproductive strategies to whether they are generalist or specialist, kind of tie that all in together. Interpret a survivorship curve and explain the survival rate of different species, again, relating it to R and K selected. Describe factors that limit growth, all those density dependent and independent factors, and explain how resource availability affects population growth. The idea of overshoot and dieback and animals increased mortality, or animals like the snowshoe hare changing their fecundity. And then our big skill that we looked at was analyzing a model or visual representation of data to explain an environmental concept. So I'm going to introduce your practice question, your homework for tonight. Remember, we have all of these task verbs. You're going to see a couple of different ones today, but no actual calculations. And there's a couple different parts to the question. I'm going to kind of walk you through a little bit of graph interpretation to get you started. So as I look at this, I want to begin, let me back up just a second here. The first comment that Dr. Sowell and I, the first idea that we want you to carry forward when you get to the national exam and your 2 FRQ is read the entire question from start to finish before you start answering. When you look at the rubrics that we're providing you and what qualifies as an adequate answer, that answer is going to come to you rather quickly. What we find both in our classes with our students, as well as at the reading, when we're reading students from all over the country that have responded to these FRQs, it's pretty obvious that students just read one little prompt at a time and aren't really processing what that question's saying. They kind of puke out the first thing that comes into their head. And the reason we know that this is the strategy a lot of kids use is because you can almost see as they're halfway through writing, they're kind of like, ah, sugar. I just realized as I started writing about this that I wasn't really thinking about it the right way, or I came up with a better example or a better way to explain it. So if you take that first couple of minutes to read the entire question, where's it starting? Where's it going? And start jotting notes about what you see there. Process that question as you're reading it. The answer that you write is going to come much more easily. Just, I know it's hard, just sit back and take a deep breath. So as I start reading this question, describe. So focus in, I've got that describe word. I would underline that. 2, I can only use my first 2, so I want to think about it. Don't waste time writing answers that aren't good. Take the time to think and process it. Put your best 2 answers forward. 2 characteristics of invasive species that allow them to outcompete native species. Well, I want to go back up to my graph here for a minute because letter B is asking me to summarize some things about the graph. And even before I look at what it's asking me about the graph, it's hard for me sometimes to both process what's on the graph and be interpreting the question that they're asking me about the graph at the same time. So if you see a graph, you know they're going to ask you things about the relationships on that graph. So go ahead and make sense of it on its own first, and then read what they want you to know about that. So I have time. Oh, I know. This didn't show up in here. There it is. We have got this little background information. So the United States Forest Service ecologist periodically sampled plant biodiversity in Mauna Kea, Hawaii, between the years 2000 and 2012. 2000 to 2012. Notice there's a key piece of information they give me here, that this was a 12-year period of drought. So during a 12-year period of drought, they were looking at the relative abundance of 2 different types of grasses. One of them is an invasive grass and one of them is a native grass. And then they've given me the total abundance of grass, both of them together. So even before I read what they want me to say about the graph, I'm going to make sense of it. Over a period of 12 years of drought, there was a change in the number of plants per unit area. This is the number of plants per 100 square meters. And I can see that in general, the number of invasive species went up and the number of native species went down over that 12-year period of drought. Now, when I read these questions, I'm not stressing out about, oh, shoot, they're asking me something and now I have to go interpret this graph. It took me 2 minutes to go ahead and do all that graph interpretation. Now, when I read these questions, they're going to be pretty straightforward to me. So you've got an A, a B looking at the graph itself. Letter C is talking a little bit about integrated pest management. And then we got a little bit of experimental design here. Our goal is that you just nail that experimental design question because you're getting to practice it in every one of our review lessons. So complete this for homework. You're going to grade it at the beginning of class tomorrow. Thank you so much for joining us in our virtual classroom. Dr. Sowell and I are really enjoying working with you and helping you prepare for the national exam in this time of difficulty. We know things are hard right now, but try to be a light for somebody. Try to think of some way that there's somebody that probably has it worse than you do in some way. Think of something that you can do to maybe make their life a little better. So Dr. Sewell will be here tomorrow talking about human population, and you'll take a look at your FRQ. Have a great rest of your day, guys. See you tomorrow or the next day.